we are going to be reviving another poor little soul. This little orchid has been way too neglected. It's outgrown its pot and it's looking like it really needs some TLC. And welcome to the Nature Company. Today we're looking at this Dendrochilum glumaceum, or should I say, it looks like it was a Dendrochilum glumaceum and wants to become one again. So let us get to repotting and explain to you a little bit of the requirements to ensure that you have a healthy, vigorous growing plant, since they are quite easy to grow and you should be able to do it at home. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Let's get all the complicated sciencey stuff out the way first. All dendrochilums have been reclassified as coelogenes. And in Latin, dendrochilum has a male form and coelogeny has a female form. So that starts to confuse the name that comes after. Instead of Dendrochilum glumaceum, it now becomes coelogeny glumacea. They really want to trip us up on this one. But often it's easier to keep dendrochilums as almost separate because it makes it easier for us to understand what we're talking about. They all have very similar flowers, and also, more importantly, they often have very similar growing conditions to each other. As we go through the repotting and revitalizing of this Dendrochilum glumaceum or coelogeny glumacea, we'll explain to you a little bit about how to make sure you can get it to grow well. So let's just have a look. Already we can see it's actually completely loose from its pot, and we see how dry the roots are. This is not something we want for our dendrochilums. They don't like to stay dry like this. This is way too dry. In fact, they like to stay on the moist side. They don't want to have that drying period during winter, as a lot of other orchids do. They like to stay moist all year round. Let's just remove this media from in between here, and then we'll give these roots a good soak and remove all the dead roots. The best time for dividing and propagating or revitalizing these, do I say coelogenes now, is at the end of their flowering season and as it starts moving in towards winter. So we almost want to do this early fall, mid-fall, in those autumn periods, just before the new growth wants to start. Because the new growth on these, see, now I'm confused again as whether I'm going to be saying dendrochilums or coelogenes. But that very initial first growth is going to start happening in winter. That's one of the reasons that you don't want to have your plant desiccated like this at any point, especially those winter months when, for instance, your dendrobiums you're leaving to look after themselves. These you want to make sure you're still giving them that moisture that they need. These are from those tropical areas down through Borneo, the Philippines. So they're often considered as warm or hot growing orchids, but a lot of them are also from the mountainous areas. They can be in the mountains up to about 2,000, 2,500 meters, which generally means you get quite cool. They're actually extremely adaptive plants. They can take temperature ranges anything from up to 0. That's what, approximately 36 degrees Fahrenheit, but they don't want to freeze. So they don't want any frost because that is just going to kill them, especially with these fine thin leaves that they have. The frost will just set in straight through the whole plant and kill it. But that doesn't mean that it can't get cold. It can adapt to cooler temperatures and to high temperatures, all the way up to around 40, 43 degrees, which is what, 100 to 109 or something degrees Fahrenheit. So their temperature range is very adaptable. But there's other parts of their growth where they're not so forgiving, like moisture. They like a lot of moisture all the time. Where other orchids may curl up their toes and die if they're getting a constant little drip from condensation, these are going to thrive. And with that need for moisture, so they have a need for humidity. They're really not going to thrive unless you're giving them humidity levels of at least 70%. That's, I would suggest, almost the minimum requirement to really get your dendrochilums or dendrochilum type cotyledons, how's that, to really grow and flower well. So while we're talking about their moisture requirements, their roots not only sensitive to desiccation and drying out like this, but they're very susceptible to rotting. They're these fine, thin roots, and too much water all the time is going to be problematic for them since they are epiphytic. So because you have to supply them with a lot of moisture, you're going to have to ensure that your media is extremely well drained and that it has lots of air movement. These are going to be essential in the health of your plant. To divide a plant, the best way to do it is just to feel around the plant itself. Feel which parts are going to want to pull away from each other. That will give you a better idea of where to go in and just remove the section. And then invariably you'll get your sections separated more easily without causing too much extra stress on your plant. And then you can go in with your clean, sanitized secateurs, nice and sharp. Find the point where the rhizomes join. Just get it in there gently and do your cut. And we've missed the point. There we go, that's where the rhizome is joined to the other pseudobulb. And we can just do a trim like that. There we can see our little cut. And this again, with open wounds like this, we'll be treating with cinnamon. That's just going to seal off the wound and stop any of those nasty fungi or bacteria being able to get in. So just a little dab on that open wound there. We'll just remove any of this dead matter from the plant. More of those roots are coming off because they are not doing anything and they're just going to cause problems in the media. Then we'll just go through, cut off any old dead parts of the leaves themselves. Notice I'm not removing the whole leaves. I'm just removing those damaged parts like that. And the reason I'm doing that is because there's so little leaf volume left on the plant that I want to ensure that it's got enough area for photosynthesis to help keep growing. Yeah, we can see those new growths that I was talking about. This is what we want to encourage to develop as quickly as possible into the new media. Also here at this section of the plant, we see these new growths coming out, but they're all overgrowing these old pseudobulbs, and they're growing towards each other, so they're going to start clumping each other out. So what we'll do is we'll just see if we can remove these two sections easily, see where they're going to loosen up. And then we'll cut at the point of the joining rhizome. And there we go, we have our plant divided up into 3 pieces. Notice I've tried to leave as much pseudobulb volume on these plants as possible, especially since they have very little leaf volume and they're going to need all of the strength to help them continue growing from these new growth points. Also, there's very little root volume, so they're not going to be able to absorb any nutrition and moisture through those roots, so they're going to be relying on these pseudobulbs now. You may also find with a lot of these Dendrochilum 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 type cotyledons are, although they're incredibly easy to propagate, timing needs to be right. They may sulk for several years if you have not timed the repotting right, and indeed some of the smaller pieces may actually die off completely. But just a simple repotting is not going to be so traumatic for them, and that can be done at other times of the year as well. Often it will be done sort of early to mid-spring, sometimes after flowering, and sometimes even just before flowering, before the temperatures start warming up and that winter initialized growth hasn't matured yet. Repotting can be done at that point as well. So what are the other specific requirements that these orchids need? Well, the light. The light is also very important to their flowering. If you give them a too dim situation, something that doesn't have enough light, that's not bright enough, then you're going to land up with stunted plants and very limited to no flowering. So ensure that you're giving them nice bright light, but not direct sunlight. Again, these broad leaves can burn in the full sun. And also talking about light, remember again, these are from those tropical zones that get long light hours throughout the year. So you're wanting to give them at least 12 hours of light if possible. If you're needing to supplement your light with artificial lighting to increase your number of daylight hours, they have found that these particularly like the red spectrum of light. So supplement them with those grow lights that have more red in them. Okay, now let's get to repotting these. One of the media that I particularly like potting my Dendrochilum type cotyledons in is in those coir chunks. But at the moment, I'm not able to get any of those. If I am, I would generally plant it in those alone without any other additives. But because I'm not able to get, I'm going to be using pine bark and sphagnum moss. These do like that just slightly more acidic mix, so the pine bark or those coir chunks often work extremely well for it. So if your water is very alkaline, then it's going to be best to try and ameliorate it slightly to make it slightly more acidic for your plants to enjoy. The mix I'm going to be using for this is basically 2/3 pine bark and 1/3 sphagnum moss. This is just going to help hold all that extra moisture for those longer periods that these orchids love without going to keep them too damp all the time. Also, because I'm using so much sphagnum moss, I'm going to be using holes in my pot because the sphagnum moss does tend to fill up the gaps between the bark slightly, and that's going to reduce the amount of airflow happening. So I'm going to be increasing the amount of airflow I can get into the pot with all those holes. And remember, these like excellent aeration. Also, they're relatively vigorous growing plants. They can grow quite quickly, but remember also we don't plant them in a pot that's going to be way too big for them, because it's not necessarily that orchids like their roots all cramped up. It's more the fact that your pot may hold too much moisture for too long because it's not going to evaporate fast enough, or there's not going to be enough air movement into the center of the pot. And that's what will cause problems for your orchid with rot, with fungal attacks, and all those other sorts of things. You want to keep the size of your pot to a fair size that's going to suit your orchid. Also, with a mix like this, remember, don't compact it down. Although the bark is going to provide some structure to reduce the amount of compaction that can take place, you don't want to be pushing that sphagnum moss into tight balls that is going to just hold that moisture and become a wet, soggy mess. And again, with these orchids, I generally plant them in the center of my pots, because although often when you're repotting, you may see only one section, although this has got growths coming out of both sides, but you also get those lateral buds on your pseudobulbs that will then, now that they've got all that extra light and air to them, will burst as well, and you'll land up with a full plant relatively quickly. So it's going to grow all the way around and not laterally in one direction. And if I could remember one of their songs, I would sing it now for you. So basically, there we go. With these, I'm not going to be reacting like I do with my cattleyas, that I will then just leave to their own devices for almost a month or sometimes even longer. These, I'm going to ensure that my media is always moist. Even at this point where you're wanting to try and get those roots to set in as fast as possible, I have very little root volume. I want to ensure that those new roots can find moisture quickly and easily, so I'm going to be watering these. I'm not going to allow them to dry out. And there we go. Also remember with these Dendrochilum type coelogenes, it becomes a long sentence now, is that although a lot of them are really easy growers, some can be quite difficult when it comes to messing with their roots. Some of them don't like too much play around their roots. You may want to reduce your potting to a minimum for those. But remember, they're not going to grow that well in inorganic media unless you have a really good watering system and your humidity levels are well above average. With them, you'll have to be really balancing your decomposition of your media and the repotting of the plant. Some people even use peat moss mixers with them, but I'm unable to control my watering that way with them because peat moss does tend to hold more moisture and it actually limits the amount of air movement through your pot because it's such a fine-grained substance. So I'm going to stick with something that's going to allow for air movement, hold moisture, and give it a bit of structure. Also with these orchids, you need to understand if your temperatures before flowering get too high. If you're getting up in those temperature ranges and your pots are getting really warm, your flower formation is going to stop and you won't get any flowers. So during those times of the year, just pre-flowering, you want to keep your temperatures around your pot cool enough to allow for that blooming to happen. Also with the really hot temperatures, ensure that you've got good air movement. When your temperatures are reaching that top range, it will start desiccating those leaves and scorch them. So ensure that you have good air movement just to keep their ambient temperatures down. Also on that cold spectrum, if it has those cold temperatures for too long, you'll start to get withering of your leaves. And your plants will have to be moved to somewhere where the temperatures are just slightly higher so that they're not so badly affected. Now that I've gone round and round in circles and forgotten where I am, if I've missed anything else, please drop it in the comments box below, or if you don't understand anything I've said or I've missaid something, just give me a shout in that comment box. And remember, Ed posts a lot of orchid-related content down in that Buy Me a Coffee link. There's a lot of free information there available for you. And also, don't be shy. Sign up, become a member, and get all that members-only content too, and grow like a pro. If you have found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.